All right. Once again, I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation, our Wildlife for You wildlife presentation. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a brand new topic. We've never talked about these critters before, but it's something that a lot of people, I'm not going to say a lot of people love, but a lot of people know a little bit about. And unfortunately, a lot of people are a bit afraid of. And the topic tonight is snakes. And so the title is Run Snake, because usually that's the first thing out of someone's mind, especially if they're not used to being around snakes and they see one. They just want to get out of that area. That should not be the case. They're wonderful animals. Now, we know we're not going to break anyone's fear of snakes here, but I mention this all the time, especially with my bear webinars, is knowledge is power. And so the more you know about these animals, the more you understand their behavior and what they're doing and what makes them tick, the more comfortable you are around these animals, even the animals that you're not really fond of. And so tonight, it's going to be myself, Daryl Radijek, and Logan Barber, who you see here, and we'll introduce ourselves in just a second and give you our background information. But sit back, relax, and hopefully you'll enjoy our presentation tonight. So I will start. We always like telling all of our participants our experience, because we want you to know that we don't just hire people that stayed in a Holiday Inn to give these presentations. We hire real-life wildlife professionals. Most of you know me. My name is Daryl Radijek. I'm a career wildlife biologist. Have spent most of my career with state and federal agencies. I worked for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency for a long, long time. I was their big game coordinator, so I was in charge of deer and bear and elk and hogs. Switched gears a little bit about 3 years ago. I now work for the federal government, but my passion is teaching people about wildlife, and that's why I created this Wildlife for You program. So most of you know my background, 20 years experience, but I'm going to let Logan Barber introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his background.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I grew up grew up underneath my father, who was working with TWRA, so I grew up on fisheries boats and things of that nature. Because of that, I went to the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, got a bachelor's in wildlife. Since then, I've worked a ton of different jobs, from everything from Kentucky State Wildlife Department to volunteering with TWRA. I now contract with TVA. I've spent time in U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I've been all over and done a lot of different things. I can't say I've ever been focused in one particular area, but I'm a really good general biologist.
All right, and I will tell you without a doubt, because my specialty is usually large carnivores or things with hair, I will have people send me a picture all the time of a snake, and I'll have a pretty good idea, but Logan is my go-to person. I'll send that picture to Logan and say, hey, is this what I think it is? And a lot of times he corrects me and he'll tell me. So Logan's the perfect person for this presentation. So with that, let's get started. And let's talk about this world of snakes. So I'm going to throw up a picture. I'm sure many of you have seen this picture. I was a little boy. I remember my mom taking me to see Raiders of the Lost Ark for the first time. And I can almost guarantee everyone in here has seen this. If you haven't, you should, because it's a classic movie. But the funny thing with Raiders of the Lost Ark, when it first came out with Harrison Ford, he was always finding himself in a predicament where he was absolutely surrounded by snakes. And he always said, snakes. I hate snakes. The thing is, it doesn't have to be that way. Lots and lots and lots of people have this phobia about snakes and just this innate fear of the unknown, because they don't really deal with snakes too much. And so what I'm hoping to do over the next 45 minutes to an hour is just talk about snakes, show you what makes them tick, and then we're going to spend quite a bit of time identifying snakes. And that's where I'm going to have Logan take over for most of the presentation. But like I said, knowledge is power. So the more you know about these animals, the better off you're going to be, the more comfortable you'll be if you ever do encounter a snake. Now, why do we have this? Well, I should not go in there yet. One of the things I want to throw up, I do know my audience really, really well, and just looking at all the people here, they love bears. Bears are cute. I love bears too. That's where I spent a good part of my career. You look at a baby bear and it's really cute. It doesn't matter what mammal you look at. You look at a baby deer, baby possum, any of those small furry critters, and for the most part, everyone thinks they're really cute. Now, I'm not a bird guy. I like birds, but I'm not a really good bird guy. There's an argument that could be made to say birds are even cute when they're young. I think they're really dorky looking, but you could still say that's pretty cute. Now, when it comes to reptiles and it comes to snakes, you really can't get cute with a snake, but I thought this was pretty close, and probably about as close as you could get to having a cute snake. But for the most part, people don't find snakes cute. They find them, I don't want to say repulsive, but there's something about them that just gives most people the heebie-jeebies. But I hope towards the end, at least you won't have as much as much disgust seeing a snake and how wonderful they truly are to the environment. So with that, why, oh why do snakes get this bad rap? Well, it's pretty darn easy. And again, looking at most of the people in this webinar, the Southeast, especially, you're in the Bible Belt, you're in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And so you're taught at a very young age that snakes are bad. If you have any type of understanding of what's written in the Bible, obviously the Adam and Eve, they were tempted by that snake, and the rest is history. But it's not just Christianity that we're talking about. You look at mythology or any other culture out there, snakes are often a part of their culture, and in many, many situations, not all, but in many situations, serpents are kind of seen as this evil beast. And so wherever you grow up, whatever culture you grow up, oftentimes snakes are not looked at as a nice, friendly type of critter to be around. And so that really drives what our feelings are, even from a young age before we could ever understand it. So, enough about that. Let's talk about snake biology. So we're going to start really simple here. Anyone that has sat in on my Wildlife for You presentations, almost everyone deals with mammals. We've done a couple bird ones, but the vast majority deal with mammals. And this is the first presentation that we're doing here that is going to deal with reptiles. Now, this is a pretty big swing in the type of critter that we're going to be talking about, because the big difference between the reptiles and those birds and those mammals is, I'm going to use a fancy word here, and I'll explain it, but we classify them as ectotherms. Not going to break down the origin of those words, but ecto does mean outer, and therm is heat. So they have to get their heat from outside their body. And generally, what that means, you've probably heard this, they're cold-blooded animals. So they can't maintain a warm body temperature. They're pretty much cold. When it gets cold outside, their bodies cool down. And so the way that reptiles have to heat up or be able to function at a temperature that allows them to move around and function, they have to rely on the sun. And so you're not going to have many reptiles or snakes. Obviously, I should have mentioned that snakes are a reptile. You're not going to have many snakes crawling around in the wintertime because it's not warm enough for them to be able to function. So most snakes and other reptiles are hibernating at that point in time. But during the late spring, all throughout the summer, early fall, when it's warm outside, you're liable to encounter a reptile. Now, I didn't have a really good snake picture, so I'll put a tortoise, which is also a reptile. But those animals, like I said, they have to obtain heat from the outside environment. So they have to warm up in the sun. The cool thing that I thought was interesting, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but because their bodies aren't functioning a lot, because when they're cool, their metabolism drops down really, really slow. You tend to have some reptiles be like really long-lived, such as these tortoises. Some of these reptiles are known to live between 100 to 150 years old, which is, I think, one of the longest-lived animals there are. So, anyway, snakes are reptiles. We're going to be talking a little bit about what they do and how they function. And so the first thing that I'm sure all of you know is snakes, unlike mammals, they don't have hair. Instead, they have modified hair in the form of scales. And this is the thing that's really, really interesting, and we were talking about it a little bit before class started. The thing with snakes, many people will look at a snake and they automatically assume that snakes are slimy like a worm. And that is completely opposite of what you would expect. I remember the very first time I ever handled a snake, it took me by surprise because they're generally dry. It is a really strange feeling. Like I said, they're not slimy at all, but it's literally like handling a mussel because their whole body just moves in different ways that we're used to. And so handling a snake for the first time is definitely an experience. And if you are bold enough to handle a snake, I tell you that will help you overcome your fears. Don't do it if you're truly afraid because it'll probably exacerbate your fears, but it is truly a unique experience the first time you ever handle a snake because they generally feel unlike what you would ever anticipate. All right. Here's another interesting thing about snakes is that they are mostly carnivorous. And the cool thing is that's one of the reasons why snakes are so good. A lot of people don't like having snakes around, but there's other critters that we sometimes like even less. And snakes, being carnivorous, usually deal with those critters. And so what am I talking about? A snake's diet is oftentimes small rodents. They'll be eating rats like you see here. They'll often eat mice that are around the house. So depending on what kind of snake it is, and many folks on here could probably attest, it's good to have like a gray rat snake or any of these non-venomous snakes around your house because they will actually keep the rodent population down. Here's another thing that's really, really cool, especially if you don't like poisonous. I shouldn't say, oh my gosh, Logan, you should kill me.
I was wondering
if
if
you
you
don't
knew
like
it or not.
if you don't like venomous snakes around your house, there's actually some snakes that will prey on some of the venomous snake species. So the fact that snakes eat other animals is actually a really cool thing. And if you like bears, I know a lot of the folks on here love bears and other carnivores. Just think of a snake as a reptilian carnivore. And so they're cool animals. All right, now this is really cool. I was looking to see what the smallest snake is and what the largest snake is. Found out some really cool things. This snake here, they come in all shapes, no, pretty much one shape, but they come in all sizes. And so this snake here is not a ribbon snake, a thread snake off the island of Barbados. You can see obviously that's a quarter. The adult length of this snake is usually about 4 inches long. So it's even smaller than a typical earthworm, which I think is super, super cool. Now let's go to the other extreme, and you could have a Burmese python that is stretching out to be about 20 feet. And I don't know how much that thing will weigh, but you can see they're pretty gosh darn big snakes. So snakes can come in a wide range of sizes, from that little tiny thread snake all the way up to those big pythons. But now let's get into some cool stuff. This is not a picture of a snake eating another snake. Believe it or not, that is the skin off a snake that is molting. And actually, since I don't handle snakes as much as Logan, you want to describe the whole concept of molting, why they do it and all that?
Yeah, so as a snake feeds and starts to grow, it basically does kind of like if you think about your fingernails. You know, you hit a spot on your fingernail somewhere in the back, and it eventually starts working its way forward to eventually lose that little spot that was on it. It's kind of how the snake works. It's underneath starts growing and growing, starts replacing scales, and instead of doing it one at a time or in one little skin cell like humans do, they replace it all at one time. So it basically the snake will get to a certain size, a certain thickness, something like that, and the old skin, the old scales will start to kind of slough off, and they normally will start rubbing their nose, something on a rock, on a stick, something like that, and kind of break the skin, and then they can use the muscles of their body to start working their way out of that skin. And normally they can shed anywhere from 2 to 4 times a year. The young that are growing faster generally shed more. As you get to older live snakes, that are maybe feeding less, not doing as much, they may only shed once or twice a year.
I have a question for you, and I love having Logan around because I always have questions about snakes too. Can you identify what species of snake it is by a shed?
Sometimes, if the pattern's really clear, you could probably get close. And then, as one of the slides I think later shows, you can tell sometimes whether or not it's venomous, depending on how the anal scales are fixed at the very end. But again, it's kind of a crapshoot depending on how good of quality it is, how recent it was, and how dedicated the pattern is actually on the skin. I've seen some that you couldn't tell, and I've picked up others that were 100% a gray rat snake.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. One thing that I always love talking about whenever we're talking about animal biology is something that you guys can relate to. How do these animals, how do their senses work? Or you have to understand their senses help them live by allowing them to find food or mates or anything else like that. And so one of the coolest things when it comes to the senses of snakes is talking about how they smell. Now, I'm not talking about how the snakes themselves smell, but how the snakes actually do the smelling. And just so you know, that whole thing about cucumbers with copperheads, probably not true, but we could talk about that later when we get to the individual species identification. But this is really, really cool when we're talking about how snakes kind of detect their environment, and they kind of move around and do most of their navigation and going about their business through their sense of smell. Now, how do they do that? Well, it's really cool. If you ever watch a snake that's just out there slithering around, oftentimes, especially when they're getting close to catching a prey item, their tongue will become really active. You'll see it go out there, flick a number of times and come back in. Go out there, flick a number of times and come back in. And literally what they're doing is they're using their tongue to smell. And it's really, really interesting. It's one of the unique things about snakes is if you look at this picture here, I love this picture because it shows the bifurcated or forked tongue of the snake. And because of that fork, when he flicks it out and he waggles it back and forth, he's picking up some of those scent molecules that are drifting in the air, and they're collecting on his tongue. And when he brings his tongue back in, he then rubs his tongue over this organ. It's called the Jacobson's organ. And it's kind of like the smell organ or the sense organ. He brings those particles that he captured off his tongue and he brings it into this Jacobson's organ, and he can detect, he can smell the things that are in the air by what he's picked up off of his tongue. And this is where that bifurcation or that fork comes in handy, because he knows if he's got more scent items on the right-hand side of his tongue than on the left-hand side, the prey is over to the right. So believe it or not, he has directional smelling or tasting of the air based on that forked tongue and this Jacobson's organ. Really, really cool thing that snakes do that is pretty unique to that species of how they can detect prey that's close by. But here's another thing. You've probably heard or seen of pit vipers. These are venomous snakes, and if you look closely, you see this weird looking hole in his head, usually between his eye and his nostril. That pit there helps them detect heat. So you have to understand, a lot of these snakes will be hunting at night when it's dark. They can't see very well, especially if it's a moonless night. And this pit that they have on the side of their head helps them detect heat. And so how does that work? Well, if you've ever watched the show Cops, where they use this thermal imaging camera and you could see like this glowing bright white guy, glowing white person running down the street, that's given a strong heat signature. And so whenever you're able to detect heat, if you're an animal out in the environment, when the sun goes down, the environment cools down. The rocks cool off, the trees cool off, the dirt, the ground, the vegetation, everything cools off. But one thing out there maintains a constant temperature. And those are those warm-blooded mammals. And so whether or not it's a human or a mouse or a deer or any other animal, they're maintaining a temperature usually above 90 degrees. And so if you have a 90-degree body and a 20-degree rock, that temperature difference can be detected by that pit, and it allows those snakes, I don't know, it's literally impossible to tell exactly what they're seeing, but we know they're using the heat signature off these animals to locate these animals. So I thought that's another really cool thing of how these snakes find prey. So enough biology. Let me stop there because I want to spend a good portion of tonight's class going through the different species of snakes. So as far as snake biology, kind of what makes them tick, does anyone have any questions, comments, or anything? I'll give you a minute. If you don't have anything, we will move on. All right, I don't see anybody typing. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to spend the rest of our time, and we want you to ask questions. We want you to chime in from this point forward as we go through these to help you get a better understanding of what kind of snake you may be encountering when you're out on the trail. So Logan, nope, I'm not going to turn it over to you yet because I got a couple more slides. The main thing when it comes to identifying snakes, and this is probably the most important lesson that you'll learn tonight, is whether or not snakes are poisonous or venomous. This is something that we get hung up. In fact, I think Gil's going to mention it in his snake article he writes, because biologists are geeks. They're nerds. Sometimes they aggravate the snot out of me, and I'm one of them. A lot of times people will be talking on social media and they'll talk about a poisonous snake. I even slipped earlier today and I said a poisonous snake. There is a difference between poisonous and venomous. And so I love this slide because this will help explain the difference between the two. An animal that is poisonous means if you eat it or if you bite it, you could die. That is a poisonous animal. A venomous animal is an animal that bites you and then you die. So whenever we're talking about snakes, and people are always talking about rattlesnakes or cottonmouths, some of these animals or snakes that can kill you, those are venomous snakes. They're not poisonous snakes. Because typically it's the snake that bites you, you're not biting the snake. However, I will tell you, not so fast, because believe it or not, there are a couple of snakes that can be considered poisonous. Just so you know, and I'm bringing this up because I think it's a really neat fact to know, is there's a genus of snakes in Asia called keelbacks that typically feed on those poison arrow frogs, those dart frogs, those really colorful frogs that a lot of the natives will use to poison the tips of their arrows or darts. Those snakes feed on those frogs. And because they're eating those frogs, if you eat that snake, you could die. I don't know anyone that would want to eat that snake, but that is a possibility. Now, having said that, in North America, believe it or not, a garter snake can sometimes be poisonous. Now, typically they're not, but if a garter snake is feeding on these certain type of newts or other salamanders that might have toxins in their skin, that garter snake can become poisonous if you decide to eat it. Nobody eats garter snakes, so we don't have to worry about this. But the main point I want to mention here is when we're talking about rattlesnakes, we're talking about cottonmouths or copperheads or any of those snakes that we're afraid of getting bit by and dying, those are pretty much what we call venomous snakes. So now, with that, we're going to talk a little bit about snake identification, and I'll turn it over to Logan as soon as we get through these slides here. Pretty typical. In fact, Logan, why don't you take over? I'm going to take a drink.
So what we're looking at here is kind of a general overall view of how to look at different snakes and kind of tell, whether or not they would be venomous. And this pretty much applies to a good bit of North America, at least, United States. what you're looking at on the very top is the water snake, non-venomous. You'll always hear people say the round pupil and kind of a rounded snout. Those are pretty true. The also, if you look at the very top of the head, you can kind of see the different scale formations between non-venomous and venomous. And then something that nobody's really going to check, but you could on most snakes, is how after the vent, which is on the underside of the snake, if the anal scales stay as one solid piece or if they divide into two. Normally, if they divide into two, you're going to look at a non-venomous snake. That's, again, something most people aren't going to pick up if they're afraid of snakes. But if you did find that snake skin, like we were talking about earlier, you could kind of tell whether or not it would be. On the bottom, we're looking at a pretty good diagram of a cottonmouth. It's showing a dark eye stripe. It's also showing the elliptical pupil, the heat-sensing pit, and then the pointed snout. With the eye, you will generally see most venomous snakes with an elliptical pupil, but this isn't a 100% guarantee. Depending on the light, snakes' eyes are just like ours. It might be that you're in a low light situation, so they have to dilate and be more round. It could be that they are more elliptical and cat-like because of, it is bright outside. It is something that can vary, but in general, if you're trying to look or if you're close enough to see, that might be a quick indication whether maybe you take an extra step back or two. And then looking at the head shape and the scale pattern on the cottonmouth diagram, you can again see that more of the larger scales are concentrated right above the eyes on the end of the snout versus all the way through the head. And then again, on the vent for the venomous snake, you're normally going to see a single anal scales going for the whole tail, even past the vent.
The one thing that we will caution you, the shape of the head, this doesn't show it, but with this previous slide, you always hear people talking about a venomous snake will have a triangular head. And that is not, they do have more triangular heads, but the coolest thing with non-venomous snakes, when they're feeling threatened, they'll flatten their head out and their head will sometimes become very triangular. We'll actually have a couple of pictures of an eastern hognose snake that readily does that, but I've seen gray rat snakes do it as well. And so some of these non-venomous snakes will try to look scary and they'll flatten their head out and form a triangular head. So just based off the shape of the head, it's not a good single indication. So hopefully what we will be able to do is just tell you lots of different things to cue in. There's not one single thing that's perfect all the time, but if you know the multiple things to look for, usually you get a whole lot better at ideaing what kind of snake it is. And for the most part, what most people want to know is this snake venomous or is it harmless? And so if you get on the internet and you Google snake identification, you're going to see all sorts of diagrams showing what to look for. And like Logan said, they could be, for the most part, they're great guides, but they're not 100% all the time. So the more you look at snakes, the better you get. This is what Logan was talking about on the underside. When you get past, the vent is the anus, correct?
Yes, basically.
Yeah, they'll have the vent on the underside, and just beyond that point, if you see that double row of scales, that's typically the non-venomous snake. And then if you have that single row, you're usually dealing with a venomous snake. And the cool thing is, if you do find a shed snake skin, oftentimes you can see that and you can at least tell if the snake was venomous or non-venomous. I love this particular slide the best because this is a surefire way to identify venomous versus non-venomous is let it bite you, and then you'll know if your hand swells, it's a venomous snake, and if it doesn't, it's non-venomous. So, okay, Logan, I don't know if you see it, but Lori asked a question. What is the best way to judge venomous or not from a safe distance, like from the car? So not getting really close.
Generally, I would kind of look at the length and the shape. For the most part, if you're looking at a copperhead or cottonmouth, normally they're shorter, stubbier snakes. You're going to kind of think that they almost look like a short, fat stick. Timber rattlesnakes, kind of the difference there. They can be a little bit longer, but again, they're going to be really girthy, just look heavy-bodied. Most of your non-venomous snakes are going to look a little bit more streamlined, a little bit longer, a little bit more rope or thread-like. And that's kind of the general thing that I first at least cue on whenever I see them.
And the one thing, hopefully, we're going to give you lots and lots of examples of it. You can look at the pattern because there's definitely some snakes that have very distinctive patterns that you could recognize really, really quickly. But like Logan said, those really thick-bodied snakes are generally the more venomous snakes, and then those non-venomous snakes tend to be a little bit thinner and more slender. So with that, all right, this is where I'm going to turn it over to you for real, Logan. So have at it and start describing some of these snakes that we may encounter. I will tell you that we're not going. I don't even know how many individual species of snakes are in North America, but there's a lot. But we are going to cover pretty much the most common ones. There may be a snake you encounter that we don't cover here, but if anyone ever encounters a snake that you don't know what it is and you're able to get a picture, by all means send it to us. And Logan or I will be able to identify and let you know what you saw. But for the most part, the snakes that we're going to show from here on out are typically the more common snakes that you may encounter when you're out on the trail.
And I just see that Janice asked a question. So what we're talking about there on that slide, a couple ones back, is the ventral scales. So it is the scales on the bottom side of the snake.
Oop.
Skip around.
Yep.
There we go. Yeah. So that's if you were looking at the underside of a snake. And like I said, that's normally what you're going to see there is if you find a snake skin out in the yard or in the garden, something of that nature, that's where you would go and find that and be like, oh, well, it looks like it's broken into double scales on the bottom underneath the tail at the very back. So you pretty much know at that point that it's a non-venomous snake.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. We don't recommend anyone picking up a live snake, to check this out. But a lot of people will do that. They'll be gardening. In fact, I did it back in my house in Tennessee where we had a shed snake skin in our front tree. And it was kind of surprising because we never see snakes there. But you could look at the skin and you could tell right away. I guess you'll have this little bit element of ease and comfort once you see that double row of scales, knowing that the snake that shed the skin in your front yard is not a venomous snake. So that's like I said, knowledge is power. If you know what's going on out there, it makes your life a whole lot more comfortable. All right, now you can take over, Logan.
All right. So we're going to start on a very, very common snake that's around here. Is the copperhead. So the number one thing you're going to look at these again, I always see these as short, maybe 2.5 foot long, and just look super stubby for their length. That's the number one thing that, again, it will cue me in that, hey, maybe I need to take a closer look. When you start looking at these, the pattern is absolutely easy to identify if you know what to look for. Oh, trying to do the draw thing. Hold on.
You got to click on the marker.
Yeah, I was trying to find the color tab too. There we go. All right. I think I've got it now. So right there, if you look right where I'm trying to circle, that if you're looking at these snakes from the side, what you're going to see is you're going to see it as a kind of a Hershey kiss pattern. If you are looking at it from the top down, it's kind of hard to tell, but you should be able to see that this looks like an hourglass, and the skinny part of the hourglass will be right at the very top of the snake's back. That is a very, very good indicator that this is probably a copperhead. Additionally, it's going to always have this kind of bronzes, maybe orange, and slightly even pink coloration. That's something that's kind of odd in most of the other snakes that you would find. So if you see that what looks like a Hershey kiss pattern from the side or an hourglass from the top, those are definite things to be looking out for on this snake. Additionally, let's click through these and see what the other ones look like on that. So yeah, so here's another one that looks very similar. Again, you can see that kind of Hershey kiss pattern going down the side. You see in this one pretty clearly too from the side, you can see that copper bronzes type head. And again, it just looks like a stubbier, shorter, snake than what you would see for something like a rat snake. Look one more. And here's how do we get the?
I think there should be a button to erase.
So right here is what you're going to see in a lot of the juvenile, and this will be in both copperhead and cottonmouth. Really, if you're encountering the snake, it might not be a big deal which it is, just so you know it is venomous, but the yellow tip tail is very, very common. It is an identifying factor for both juvenile copperheads and cottonmouths.
That was me, I'm sorry. Okay, take back over. I was trying to answer Trish.
You're good. So yeah, marking on it right there. So if you see anything like that, they actually use that as what's called a caudal lure. It's they wiggle their tail back and forth, and it actually makes small mammals or even insects will attract it to where they think it's something they can feed on, and once they come in to bite the tail, the snake can actually feed. And this is pretty, again, this is pretty common and very, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but it's an identifying feature for stuff in the Agastrodon genus, which would be both your copperhead and cottonmouth. And Trish, I actually like that really well. It looks like he's wearing a ton of bow ties. That's a really good description. So here we have kind of the cousin of the copperhead. It's the cottonmouth, probably one of the most um, mythological snakes out there. Everybody has stories or things that they've heard or friend of a friend told them something about. These are going to look fairly similar because, again, they're in the same genus. They're just a little bit different on the species. So if you look on this snake, you're going to see a lot of the same pattern that we saw before. Oh, I'll get my color. Again, you're going to see kind of that Hershey Kiss kind of pattern that runs down the side. This one, though, for these snakes is going to be a little bit more pixelated. It'll look like it's almost out of focus compared to what the copperhead looked like. Again, if you look at this one, it's a shorter, kind of just stubbier, fat kind of snake. And then, as everyone knows from the cottonmouth name, that singular white mouth is fairly identifying, especially if it's done in this position. A lot of snakes can have a different color, wider mouth, but when they are assuming this position with the open gape and it stays in that range, that is a really good indication that you've come up and probably you're a little too close to it for comfort. The next big thing that kind of separates out your copperhead and cottonmouth on IDs, and especially with a lot of your water snakes, if you're going to be looking at the picture on the right hand side, is this really dark eye line. That line that runs from the back of the head up to about the tip of the nose, that is something that is very much an identifying characteristic for a cottonmouth. If you see that around the eye, you need to take a couple closer looks, maybe take a step two back, just so you can get a good picture of the snake. The difference between this and what you'll see later on with a lot of your regular water snakes is the water snakes will actually have black vertical bars, contrasting this that is a black horizontal stripe.
And notice the elliptical eye on that.
Mm-hmm. So here we've got the same thing. The cottonmouth and copperhead, to an extent, generally start out much more vividly colored, but as they get older, they can start losing their color, losing their pattern. So here is a cottonmouth that if you were looking for that pattern, you're not really going to see it. You can kind of make it out here and there, but it's going to be much harder if you really don't know what you're looking for, or if you're a little nervous or scared. However, if you look at what I said for the eye stripe, and look right there at the front of the head, you can see that vertical line, or sorry, horizontal line running the length of the skull up to the top of the nose. That's going to be that identifying characteristic. And again, you can kind of make out some of the pattern, but that eye stripe is going to be the number one thing. And going back to the very first one, again, it's a shorter, kind of stubbier snake. Those are the definite things to be looking for most of these venomous snakes you could encounter. Here's a picture of a more juvenile type cottonmouth. Again, you can see the pattern a little bit better on this one. It's still got this dark eye stripe coming right in. That's pretty identifying. And again, it has that hourglass type pattern that's running down. And up here, you can kind of see a little bit more how it would look like an hourglass if you're up top down. But again, Hershey Kiss from the side, either one of those. Here's probably what I would say is one of the most feared snakes, at least in our region, around Tennessee and such, is the timber rattlesnake. It's very, very easy to identify. Normally it's a little bit longer, excuse me, but it is still a heavy, very stout-bodied snake. This one kind of has the same kind of marking as with the cottonmouth. You're going to see a lot of times this dark eye line that's going to go around from the back of the skull again to pretty much the eye, maybe the tip of the nose. Another thing you're going to see is this kind of broken chevron, kind of like squiggly, sharp angled lines that go across the back of the snake. And these will run pretty much across the back and down the belly. You can see sometimes they're broken here and there. but that'll be a pretty much an identifying feature there, as well as they'll often have that dark stripe, either maybe a darker black, an orange, something of that nature that run all the way down. Again, we're looking at, you can still see the elliptical eye and the heat pit right there, right on the front of the face. If you're that close, again, you're going to pretty much immediately pick it up. These also, of course, from their name, have the rattles on their tail. So you're going to be able to hear them normally if you get too close or make one feel uncomfortable. And you can see it in this picture. Everybody, I'm pretty sure, is fairly familiar with them. But if you aren't, these can be, anywhere from 1 to 2 inches long, depending on how many rattles that are there. But that is something that normally they will signal, they will buzz if you've made them feel uncomfortable. It kind of sounds like a very, very loud insect, and mixed with almost a baby rattle, I guess is a good thing to say. But generally, I've found these snakes to be very docile. They're not something that I've encountered a lot of angry ones. Most of the ones that I've ever encountered seem to be very happy to just slide on, and go on about their way. Here again, we can see those chevron patterns running down the side. And you see again that dark line that runs the back end of the snake right on the crest of its back.
And the one thing that I think we should add is there's lots of different varieties of rattlesnakes. Even in the southeast, it's not just timber rattlesnakes. There's a pygmy rattlesnake. There's a number of different rattlesnakes all across North America. But the timber rattlesnake is probably one of the more common ones you might encounter if you're out on the trail.
Yeah, the eastern diamondback would be the only other one I'd say you'd probably hit, depending on what region of Georgia or Florida you might be in, a little bit more coastal areas. They can be a little bit more common. They are roughly the same type body shape, but they would have a more varied pattern with a very pronounced diamond pattern running down their crest of their back. As far as the pygmy rattlesnake, they can be highly variable, but really they don't grow more than about 8 to 12 inches long. And they're actually in a fairly steep decline from what we assume. And if you happen to come across any of those within a Tennessee, Kentucky region, if anybody lives in those areas, please send the pictures to anybody that you can that's a biologist, because there's several studies going on trying to map those populations. And again, here's another one with the timber rattlesnake. You can see the same kind of pattern, and then you can also see something that generally starts to happen as the snakes age. If you notice, the color at the very end normally starts turning into kind of a blackish type tail. This can be an identifying factor. It's going to be one of those things that I've seen some that are almost entirely black. I've seen some that just had a little bit at the tail, kind of like this one. It almost looks like its rattles are completely darkened out. But this can be in any stage, but that could be another thing to kind of tip you off to maybe it is a rattlesnake. If you're not hearing rattles, if you've only got a little bit of a glimpse, but you saw a very drastic color change from a bronzish, maybe even kind of pinkish, down to a black or a really dark brown, that could be something to look at. There are other snakes that can have those kind of patterns, but it's still something that could be an identifier, at least to give you kind of a pause to maybe think before you take another step, or maybe grab it thinking it's something else. So here's one that I don't really deal with in Tennessee, but it is throughout the South, and there are several different species actually in North America that can have highly variable color patterns, but the most typical thing to remember here is the red against yellow is the old rhyme that it'll kill a fellow. If it was red against black, you're okay, Jack. So there are different snakes that have mimicries of this, and most of those snakes will be red and black touching versus the red and yellow. Again, this is a snake that I unfortunately don't have a lot of knowledge working with, because it's something that doesn't exist in my region.
I will tell you one thing that I learned while researching this presentation is these venomous coral snakes, and they're mostly coastal type of snakes. They do spend a lot of time in the water, but the coral snakes tend to have the black face, whereas some of the other snakes that mimic it will not have the black face.
Yep, that's correct. So here you're still seeing that very vibrant pattern. The red against the yellow is just super easy identifiable when you see it. It's very striking if you ever do see it in person. And one more time, and like Daryl was saying, pretty much all of these you can see that at least most of the tip of the nose and a little bit of the top of the head has always pretty much been black. So it does have that black coloration at the very tip of its face.
Okay. Now, I think that was the last venomous snake. So does anyone have any questions about venomous snakes? We only covered 4 of them. Those are the 4 more common ones. But any question on the venomous snakes?
Lori, to answer the question, is a snake bite always fatal? It's actually almost never fatal, even from most of your, like what you would consider your biggest or worst snakes in North America. Roughly around 8 to 10,000 people are bit from snakes each year. 2 normally die, if that. There are several years that pass that nobody dies. Um, a lot of what you see when you start looking at statistics for people that have passed away from snake bites, normally those are coming from regions, such as Asia, Africa, things like that, that have venomous snakes, but not as good of healthcare and things around, that we do in most of North America. If you get bit normally somewhere in the U.S., you've got a fairly close drive to a hospital, and even if not, the antivenom and stuff that normally is on hand in most areas keeps it from being very bad.
I will tell you, oftentimes, especially with copperhead, oftentimes everyone knows that there's anti-venom that hospitals carry, extremely expensive. So oftentimes what many hospitals do, especially with bites from a copperhead, which tend not to be as, I don't want to say as venomous, but as lethal, they don't even treat it with anti-venom. They'll just watch the person, just make sure that they're comfortable, give antibiotics, give painkiller, but they just let it run its course.
I see Trish. As far as snakes that are not as aggressive, most of them aren't. I mean, really, most of them are defensive. We're, several thousand times bigger than they are walking through the woods, and normally we're stomping down close to them before we ever see them. They're not really being aggressive. They're kind of freaked out that a giant's about to hit them. So normally it's being defensive. They will normally sit there and stand their ground. They, could potentially come at you, but generally what that is most of the theories, at least, there's no way to, 100% prove it. But normally they're seeing shade, something dark underneath you, or perhaps you're behind or between it and where it's trying to escape to. So before you know it, you've already kind of cut off its escape route.
I'll answer Gil's question, and then you can take Ginny's question. Gil, it's funny, we were talking about that right before you logged in, actually, because as a biologist, you hear stories all the time of people saying that they were chased by a snake. And I've had people tell me that they were chased 100 yards. And I'll never tell anyone that's not what happened, but that's probably not what happened. Snakes aren't likely to chase you because, like Logan said, they're in a defensive mode. You are this monstrous creature. They're not looking at you because they're going to eat you or feed on you, so they have no reason to chase you. And if they're in a defensive mode, there's no reason they would go after a person. They want to get away from a person. And so the likelihood of a snake chasing anyone is pretty slim. Now, having said that, I've been canoeing down the Duck River or just one of those slow-moving rivers, and I've had some water snakes, the banded water snakes that will swim towards the canoe, and people get the impression that it's coming there to attack. They, believe it or not, they're not venomous, but they seem to be one of the more the bolder snakes that don't have that fear of people as much as some of the other snakes. But as far as snakes chasing people, I just don't see it happening.
And Jenny, I see that you ask a water moccasin the same as a cottonmouth. It is. It's just different terms used between different people. And also saw Ashton. The rattles aren't necessarily indicative of age because depending on how many sheds it's been through, it could have different amount of rattles, and it could even be genetics from stuff I've read. Is that different snakes could pretend to produce different amounts of rattles. So it's not necessarily if you find one with 14 rattles, it's 14 years old. That's not always true, but it is kind of that old wives' tale.
Logan, I got a question for you. Does each shed add a rattle?
Not necessarily, but it can.
Okay.
From what I understand, I could be wrong on that, but from what I understand, that most of them it can add and it can be left over there, but it's not necessarily every time.
Okay. We'll wait until Barb gets her question out, but then we will move on to the non-venomous snakes.
Barbara, that's often what really happens with a lot of snake bites and even a lot of the venomous spider bites that you hear about. Most of the times you're dealing with an allergic reaction that can be compounding of what the venom was actually doing to the person. And a lot of times too, those same people have underlying health issues that can exacerbate such an incident.
All right, you're back in charge, Logan.
All right, we'll go on to some of the more non-venomous snakes. So here's one that it's very common. You'll often find this out in the garden. You'll find it out in the grass in front of your house, stuff like that. It's a garter snake. This kind of checkered, weird little pattern that runs down the back of it. It normally has three lines, kind of one on the side, one on each side, then one down the middle, and then these kind of black spots that almost make it look checkered down the back of it is a really good indication of a garter snake. Most will always have this pattern. A couple will lose them here and there. And depending on your region, there are several different varieties of these, or a lot of subspecies of a lot of these snakes we're about to go through. So depending on where you're at, things could vary a little bit color-wise. These will often be tan with a little bit lighter tan, or possibly even kind of a green with a yellow in it. And they're generally maybe 2 foot long. And again, you can kind of see this compared to the other snakes. You can see it. We're looking at a non-venomous snake that is very slender, and it looks almost proportional for how wide it is when you're looking at how long it is. Here again, you can see that kind of alternating checkered pattern on the back. It's something that, like I said, they normally always will have. And like we were saying earlier, when you're looking at the triangle head, it's not necessarily something you can believe, because here's just a little garter snake, but look how triangle that head looks like. They often flatten these out as a defensive mimicry. So if you were looking at something just like head shape, you're not really gonna, you're gonna be unsure about something like this. And I've seen them flatten out. You can even see up top here where it's almost flattened out its body to look wider and thinner, or wider and fatter, which would be again indicative of a more venomous snake. But this is just one of those little guys that loves to play the bluff game. Here is going to be one of those ones that's going to exhibit a different color pattern. So you're going to see a little bit more of a reddish and orange in here. But again, have that alternating checkered pattern. You've still got those three lines that kind of run down the snake on either side and down the crest of its back. And you can kind of see, if you look up top, you're looking again at the rounded pupil, which is not always indicative, but here it is. And again, if you just look at this snake, to me, it just looks long and slender, almost like a shoestring, versus something like a little stump or a little stick.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but garter snakes are pretty much one of the only species you'll see that has those long vertical stripes that run down the length of the body.
Your ribbon snakes can too, and depending on which one you're looking at, it can be a little hard. Sometimes you have to look at the scales around the lips and see the coloration on those. But if you see those long lines like that run all the way down the body, I don't know of a venomous snake, at least in my area, that would ever look like that. Here's something that is probably the most common snake for people to encounter. This is the gray rat snake. This is a species that has a numerous amount of subspecies and colorations all throughout North America. But this is one of those snakes that if you find something climbing in your house, if you see a snake that's gone really far up a tree, it's climbing on top of your wall, if it's in your shower really high up, possibly in your attic, this is generally going to be a rat snake. They're great climbers, and if you ever think of a snake like how to get there, you're probably looking at a rat snake. Let's see if I can find one of these next pictures. So here you can often see they have a saddle pattern that run down the crest of their back, but as they age and grow, that pattern can actually kind of go away and turn more blacked out and more drab. But again, you're going to look at, this is somewhat a heavy snake, but it still looks proportional for how long it is. If you look up top, you're going to see a slightly sloped head, kind of rounded. You'd be able to see a rounded pupil. And you can see a good contrasting color here from up your dorsal versus your ventral, which is your top versus your bottom. Let's see if this next one maybe has there. So here it's a little bit harder to see in the picture, but you can kind of see the blotches that run down it. Those are the little saddles. It's something that is very, very easy to see once you ever get one up close. And again, this is one of those things with rat snakes. They're great climbers. They love finding eggs in trees from birds. That's one of the reasons they also called chicken snakes from much of their range. But this snake climbing up a tree like this, how'd that snake get there? Again, you're probably looking at a rat snake. Here is a kind of a cousin of the rat snake. It's actually a red rat snake from some terms, but it's a corn snake, and this is what you'll often find in a lot of your pet trades. Again, it's a kind of a heavier bodied snake, but it doesn't look disproportionately wide to its length. You can see again a rounded pupil, a more kind of gently sloping rounded forehead, and then here you're going to see going to be a kind of a shortened version of what a rat snake would have, but it's these saddles that go on the crest of the back all the way around, and they'll kind of start bunching up towards the tail region as it gets a little smaller down there. They might kind of run into one single color, but you're going to be looking at normally an orangish to a potentially reddish kind of color, and it's going to be fairly similar, and these are going to be separated with this really thin black line that go all the way around it that kind of differentiate the one color scales versus the other. Here you can see the pattern really well. This is, if you change this to more of the blackish and a yellow pattern, or like a drab brown and gray, this would be almost exactly what a gray rat snake would look like. Again, they are cousins, but you can see that kind of saddle formation, slightly different color from the rest of the scales, separated by a little bit of a black line in the scales, more rounded head. You can see again, kind of in this one, that's slide from way back that had the larger scales that run further back on the head. You can see that pretty clearly there if you compare those two slides. And again, like I always refer back to, it doesn't look disproportionately wide to its length. Here again, it's another one, and these corn snakes can be highly variable in coloration. Here you see a much more drab one. You can see on the head end of it, it seems to be a little bit brighter, but then it also kind of goes into a darker color. These can kind of fade out depending on age, depending on species, or even range. Again, there are a ton of subspecies of a lot of these snakes, but here we still see the same kind of coloration, still see the same kind of saddle patterns running around, separated by thin black lines, and then you can see again kind of a more rounded head shape.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the corn snakes, those are one of the more common pet snakes. Is that correct?
It is. It is probably the most common snake in the pet trade. If you go to most of the wildlife nature centers, environmental education centers, most of those places you're going to end up having, getting a hold of a corn snake or seeing one in an enclosure.
Susan asked a question regarding the corn snake and whether or not it's easily confused with a copperhead. I think the orange coloration could be a little confusing at first, but I think what would be the easiest way to differentiate between a corn snake and a copperhead?
So on a corn snake, if you look, you see how the part I've circled there is actually fattest on the very crest of the back. A copperhead would be exactly opposite of that. The larger portion of that pattern would be on the sides rather than the top. The pattern would be very skinny. Here, I think maybe there's another one we can see. If you look over here, where I'm circling now, these are pretty consistent. They almost like saddles or square blotches that run all the way down, and they're pretty even from one side all the way through the crest of the back all the way on the other side. The copperhead, if we go back, I'll get back real quick. It had that Hershey Kiss type pattern. So it was, I think Trish said like bow ties. So you see in this one how thin it is up top versus where it is on the side.
Go back one more. There you go.
Yeah, so there's a good one, yeah. So again, you can see this Hershey Kiss pattern that kind of widens out on the edges of the snake, on kind of the sides of it versus the very top. That's going to be one of the easiest ways to identify them, and I think this other one shows it well too. Yeah. So this one shows the same thing as well. You can see again that looks like he's wearing little bow ties. The bow ties are on either side, and the knots on the very crest of the back. Comparing that to the corn snake that had just what looked like a big square stamp on it almost. Let's see. Back to it. Yeah. So that looks just more like almost like a square, like postage stamp, just stuck right on the back of the snake.
Just so you know, I want to give comfort to everyone out there. I'm learning a whole bunch because, like I said, Logan's my go-to man, and what he's telling me right now regarding the square pattern on the corn snake, I never realized that, but I see it now in the pictures.
Yeah. And again, they can vary depending on where they are in the snake, but that's just a good general rule of thumb. So, see what next one is. So this one is probably there's another fairly mythical snake, eastern hognose. You have a couple different varieties again, a lot of subspecies, but this one's commonly known as a spreading adder. If you've ever heard anybody talk about it, that was a spreading adder or even a spitting adder or something I've heard it called. They are very identifiable. The very tip of their nose is blunt, very turned up, and if you ever really encounter one, they will do this 100% display of fanning out their head almost like a cobra. And you'll often hear people even say, like, "Oh, I saw a cobra. You know, it hissed at me and flattened out its head. It's going to be a hognose. I will almost guarantee it." So here we're going to go back and see. If you look at this snake, you're going to kind of see it looks a little short and stubby. It's not that, it's a little bit disproportionate, heavy than it is long. And the reason for that is this is actually a venomous snake. It's just not necessarily normally a medically significant venomous snake. It's one that is not encountered a whole lot anymore and is really often reluctant to bite. And the pattern on this one is a little variable. You can see these that are completely colored out. They generally will have these large markings right behind the head. This is something that I've seen, numerous times. But you also have this kind of varied pattern that's almost an inverse of what the rattlesnake looked like, of the light patterns running between dark blotches instead of dark patterns running between light. But again, this snake is very, very, very reluctant to bite. It's normally, I'd say less than 2 foot from most of the ones I've ever found. Here's another one. It's the same exact snake. You can kind of tell here that it does have that turned up nose and almost looks like it's puffing its cheeks out at you. This is just a very common defensive display if you run into one of these snakes. Again, they are venomous. They can cause you a little bit of problem, but normally it's like bee sting, slight, allergic reaction type stuff like that. Nothing that is extremely medical significant. But again, if you ever are bitten by any snake, again, and especially don't know what type it was, it is always best to seek medical treatment just to make sure that you don't have any kind of adverse reaction. Everybody reacts to things differently, but these are really cool snakes if you ever find them. And here is what probably the second most thing they're ever famous for is they love to play possum. They will flip over, even expel some of their mouth, like to stick their tongue out, stuff like that, and make it look like they've just been run over in the road. They love to play dead. This is a great defensive mechanism for them. And if you ever find one here, it's not great because it does stress the snake out, but you can actually turn it over onto its stomach and it'll flip itself back over. They will do this for as long as they can. Eventually, if they think that you're not going to leave it alone, it will normally kind of roll back over and just haul butt to get away from you. If you ever find one, it is a neat trick to kind of see it do once or twice, but remember, if it's doing this, you are severely stressing the snake out. But it does show that one of the ways to identify is here, this is just a stark white belly, and this is very common for most of your hognose. And if you ever see a snake doing the display, I don't know of anything else in North America that does such a thing. Here's going to be another snake that has a lot of different variations. It's a king snake. This is pretty much an eastern king snake. Here we've got large black saddles that are separated by slight, normally white, but it can be yellow bands depending on the subspecies, depending on the area you're in. You see again, it's kind of a rounded head. It's not very triangular. The snake again looks very much, proportionate. That's one of the best ways, again, that I'll always keep hammering home for you to tell anybody and kind of keep in the back of your mind. If it looks proportionately long to width, you're probably not dealing with a venomous snake. And we've got a couple others. So here's the king snake. Again, depending on where you're at in Tennessee, you can actually have a couple different species, and that some of them will even interbreed. Here it's just a very drab snake, but again, if you're this close, you're kind of looking, you do see the rounded pupil. You don't see any kind of discernible pattern. A little bit of a line, a little bit of the saddles here and there, but generally this will kind of be washed out. Sometimes they will be whitish or yellowish underneath, depending on where you're finding them at. And this version of the snake will sometimes have more of a yellowish kind of appearance to it. But again, if you're finding something like this that is kind of a drab snake, that if you weren't really trained, you might not know what it was when you're looking at, again, that length to width kind of ratio is something you would look at. Here's another one, the same thing. These king snakes can be, completely blacked out. So you'll often hear people talk about black snakes. Black snakes can be several different versions. They can be dealing with a cottonmouth. You could be dealing with, a rattlesnake. You could be dealing with a black racer, rat snake, or a king snake. But here again, we're not seeing any kind of discernible pattern. The snake doesn't look very stubby. You can kind of see what looks like the head down here that's a little bit more rounded. You're not seeing any kind of rattle or anything on the tail. So if you find something like this, it'd be, just kind of putting it all together little by little is what it might look like or what it could be, and just kind of checking things off the list as you go through. So here's a snake that I've actually chased a lot and never caught. When I was working as an intern in Kentucky, we set traps for these in order to try to find the populations and see if they were still around one of the WMAs I was working on. We never actually caught one. But they are gorgeous little snakes. If you can ever, again, these are snakes that you might find in nature areas or conservation centers that you ever go to that have snakes that can be held or given to the public. And this is one of those coral snake mimics. If you look, you're looking at red against black. You're not seeing any kind of yellowish coloration, although sometimes some of these snakes can have that. You're looking at red against black, which gives you a general kind of, hey, this is probably okay. You're looking at rounded pupils, and again, kind of a rounded head. And, once again, repeating myself, a ton, is that it still doesn't look very disproportionate. One thing I will say that I did forget, whenever you get into the coral snakes do have round pupils. That is something that can be a problem if you are in that range. So that coloration is one thing to really look at. And again, the coloration can vary. It's best to kind of check with your state agencies. Most of them have pages of the snakes in your area. It's a really good idea to look and see if you do have any kind of odd color variations of those snakes. But coral snakes will have round pupils, but so that can be something that does trick you on those, and that's one reason that these mimics are really good. Here's kind of the same thing. You can see coloration variation on them. This almost, even looks like a little bit like a milk snake uh, because of the severely dark black bands that are going in between the patterns on it. But again, you're seeing a rounded pupil. You're seeing that same color uh, scheme. The red's hitting the black. You're not having any kind of red against yellow. Again, that holds pretty true through a lot of the areas you'll be in. And another just really pretty, again, the colors. You can always see red against black, rounded pupils, rounded nose. Um, and go ahead.
I was going to say, remember the coral snakes had the black nose and the black forehead.
Yep. And if you look at most of these, they've all had more reddish, faces on them. That one does have a little bit of the coloration coming in, but still not its actual face. So that is something that can be helpful on that. You are right on there. There's a black racer, probably one of the snakes that'll scare you the most because by the time you see it, normally it's shot out from underneath your feet and hauled butt somewhere. This snake, to me, one of the biggest things I look at is it'll normally be a dark black, bluish kind of color with a whitish and bluish underside. And for racers, I generally always see this really large eye. It's rounded, but it just almost looks, I kind of say like a telescope almost. It's much rounded, much more large than you would see on a lot of the other snakes. These snakes also do what's called periscoping. So if you see a black snake that's in your yard that's holding the top couple inches of its head up above grass and vegetation, and you can kind of see it's looking, that's actually a hunting behavior, and they're absolutely known for doing it. So that's a very good indicator for something on these snakes. The pattern is pretty much just black. When they're juveniles, you can see kind of a rat snake pattern on them when they're really, really young, but for the most part, they turn dark and just are very, very drab snakes. But again, if you go back to one of those first slides, you can see that the larger scales make up most of the head rather than being concentrated at the nose. You can see a rounded pupil, that black, bluish kind of color with a light underside that starts white and then kind of goes to a bluish color at the end. And again, if you're looking at the proportion of the snake, it still looks very thread-like, very shoestring-like. These snakes can reach a pretty good size, and a lot of times they're not very happy when you find them, but they normally just, by their name, just race away from you when you do encounter them. And here's another one. Again, you're looking at just that absolute kind of drab color, a little bit of discoloration underneath it you can kind of see, but you're still looking at this one. For me, that eye just looks a little bit bigger. And then you're also seeing that rounded head, a lot of the larger scales on top of the head. And this is one of those ones that whenever, even if I saw it out in the woods, I'd have to take a second and kind of look at it again, because this is one of those ones that would throw me because there's just not a lot of markings and it looks a little bit off on coloration. Here's a fairly common snake. Again, you'll find these a lot in gardens. It's the ringneck snake. This is very easy to identify because normally it has this ringed collar right at the very top. Sometimes us biologists are really good about giving things easy names like that. On the underside, it can be anywhere from orange to yellow. It normally has a little bit of the speckle pattern on it, and the top is normally a grayish, could be slightly kind of brown or even black, depending on, again, the subspecies or where you're at. But that ring around the neck is one of the most identifying things that you'll ever see. Here it is again. You can see this one has a little bit less color to it, but it still has that ringed collar right around its neck. You get, again, the rounded pupil. These snakes aren't going to get much more than maybe 12, 14 inches long. They're not very big, but they are very, very common. And if you're mowing your lawn or in the garden, you're probably going to see these guys. Here, the same thing. You're seeing another drab snake. You can see a little bit of color up top on the other side of the tail, but again, you're going to see that collar right around the neck. That's always going to be my first thing that I look at on these guys. It's just something that it's hard to miss. And here is probably maybe the second most misidentified snake. It's a DeKay's brown snake. These guys love to eat little slugs, insects, and they are extremely common in everybody's yard and gardens. They're going to have a pattern a lot like a garter snake. They're going to have that kind of black checkered pattern that runs down their back. But they're always going to be this almost drab brown that is just, it just almost seems basic to give you the best example of it. One of the identifying things for these guys that I always look for, though, is this broken collar that's on the back of their neck. This is going to be the dark spots with a broken white or broken lighter scales in between, is going to be the main thing that I'm going to look for on these little guys, as well as the vertical mark kind of right behind the eye. These are going to be super identifying for these guys. And if you mess this up with a garter snake still, you're looking at two non-venomous snakes that are very, very similar. Here, when it looks much like that garter snake that we saw before, but again, you can see kind of the broken collar at the base of the head, and it's still going to have that dark eye line, or dark line right behind the eye. And it's going to have, again, that checkerboard kind of odd pattern that goes just to a super drab color. These guys don't get much bigger than 12 inches. Here, the same thing. Got a collar. It's slightly less broken, but still there. And again, that dark eye line behind the eye is the things that I'm always going to look for on these guys. But if you're mowing your yard and you look down and see something, a lot of people think these are baby copperheads. Again, you don't see any kind of Hershey Kiss pattern. You don't see any kind of really thick or dedicated pattern. It's kind of just a jumbled mess of black dots or black specks. That's one of the best things to look for on these guys. Let's see. And this is probably the most misidentified snake in the U.S., and it's the banded water snake. These guys, the biggest thing that I'll say, and I know we're running a little long, so I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit, but the head on these guys, if we go back to the cottonmouth and look, remember I was telling you to look for the horizontal eye stripe? Well, if you look for these vertical black bars on the mouth of the water snakes, almost every water snake, which is of the Nerodia genus, will have these bars that run straight down the mouth. And they're super easy to see from a far away. These snakes can be kind of thick as well as long, but they're still, to me, look a little bit more proportional than most of the venomous snakes. And again, if you look at these snakes, they're going to have this pattern that's even on the sides, but either even on the top or maybe even wider on the top versus what the cottonmouth and copperhead had. Same thing here. It's another Nerodia genus. You can see that the pattern is wide on the back and very skinny on the sides, which would say that it's definitely not cottonmouth or copperhead. But again, these are very easy to misidentify because they are going to be in a lot of the same type of regions that you would find, cottonmouths. Um, it, Water snakes are very common. They inhabit a lot more area than the cottonmouth actually does. But if somebody's worried about seeing a cottonmouth when in the water, these guys can look really similar if you're a little spooked by them. Here again is another one. You can see that the pattern, this is more of a juvenile, but see that the pattern is very thick and wide on the very back of the snake. Again, that's indicative that it's not the pattern of a cottonmouth or a copperhead. And you can see that pattern go down, and as it goes to the side over here, you can see that there's almost no or a very, very skinny pattern on the edges of the snake. This one, it looks to be a diamondback water snake. These guys get huge. They are massive snakes that generally hide on logs or in tree branches over the water. You'll often see these guys and really wonder, like, how could a snake be that big? That's generally going to be a big diamondback water snake. They have a chain link pattern, if you actually look at them, that goes down the back. And you can't really see it in this picture, but if you see one from the top down, it looks just like a straight up metal chain link fence that runs down. But again, the snake, it looks heavy, but it doesn't look disproportionate. All right.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions? We've only got a couple more slides to go, but does anyone have any other snake identification questions? And I do apologize. There's so many other snakes out there that we could present, but we're already running at an hour and 20 minutes. We didn't touch on many of the western snakes, and so I'll apologize to Kelly, who's out in California. There's sidewinder rattlesnakes. There's some really, really cool snakes out in the west. But since most of the folks on here will be encountering the snakes that we showed today, if anyone has any questions, by all means, like I said, if you ever encounter a snake and you don't know what it is and you're able to get a picture, send it to us at Wildlife for You, and I'll probably send it on to Logan to confirm everything. But as you're typing your questions, let me go through a couple of these snake myths. I threw these in at the end because I think these are kind of interesting. The one thing that you will often hear is people will constantly say that juvenile snakes, venomous juvenile snakes, are more dangerous than the adults because when they're really young, they can't control their venom. And the jury's still out on that, but that is a myth because it doesn't matter if it's a juvenile snake or an adult snake, they can still be big time problems. And so to relax because an adult snake bit you and thinking that it didn't inject a lot of venom, that's nothing that you should really think of or go by. And so the fact of the matter is, if you've got a really tiny copperhead or cottonmouth that bites you and injects all of its venom, it's probably still the same amount of venom that an adult snake would inject on a half a bite. So this idea that juvenile snakes are more dangerous is not true, but you will hear that all the time. Another snake myth out there is, and we touched on this, Ashton, you asked an awesome question before. A lot of people think that you can tell a snake's age, a rattlesnake's age, by counting the buttons or those rings on its rattle, and those do not correspond to years. Every once in a while it might line up, but the fact of the matter is, since a snake can molt multiple times in a single year and add a rattle each time, it does not correspond to that being the exact age in years. So that too is a myth that hopefully is busted. And last but not least, I'm sure some of you, or I hope some of you, I know Logan has heard of this myth before, but a lot of old timers will talk about hoop snakes. And they're a snake that they'll bite the end of their tail and they'll be able to roll or travel by rolling like a hoop. That is just an old wives' tale or an old timer's tale, because that is not true either. None of the snakes will do that. And last but not least, you'll hear people say snakes are awesome. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to tell you that is true because they are pretty darn cool. They're so unique, so different than what we typically think of. Because, like I said, I know my audience. I know they love the mammals and the furry, cuddly stuff. But the fact of the matter is, snakes they serve a tremendous purpose within the environment. They keep rodent and insect populations down. In fact, I was reading a study just yesterday about the amount of parasites, the amount of ticks that rattlesnakes consume. Now, those snakes aren't going around eating ticks, but what they're doing is they're eating rodents that carry a lot of the ticks. And so the fact of the matter is, I talk about it all the time with the ecosystem. It is so critical to have every part of that ecosystem intact. So every species is important. And so just as bad as it is to add an invasive species, you don't want to lose any native species. And Logan mentioned pygmy rattlesnakes. They're in massive decline. There's is it a fungus that's affecting the rattlesnakes, or what is it that I forget the term
The
for it?
pygmies are actually probably going from habitat loss is normally one of the biggest things. They have it like grassland, woodland, and like floodplain areas. But since a lot of the dams and things like that have happened, they've kind of changed the availability of that habitat. There is the emergent disease of snake fungal disease that is coming in.
That's what I was thinking of. All right, let me wrap up here. Summary: we're going to keep it really simple. Snakes rock. And Lori, I just read your thing. I didn't expect to flip anyone to go from not liking snakes to loving snakes. I knew that was probably a tall order, and we were never going to fulfill that. But the main thing we want to do with this presentation is give you some information so you have a better understanding of snakes. So at least when you see it, you can identify venomous, non-venomous. Hopefully you'll be able to identify species. And hopefully one day, might not happen, if it does, that'd be fantastic. But hopefully one of you out there might actually grow to appreciate and like snakes a whole lot better. But we knew that as a mighty tall order, thinking that we'd get you to love snakes. But they are a really cool animal. And let me wrap up here, and then we'll answer whatever questions you have. Again, tremendous shout out to folks that donated pictures. I know Logan gave me a bunch, but I did pull a bunch of them off the Tennessee Watchable Wildlife site. Fantastic folks there with Matt, Rob, and Scott all taking photos. I put that picture up there on the right hand side. Has anyone seen that picture on the internet or on Facebook lately? Unfortunately, what that gentleman is holding there is not a snake he should pick up. It turned out to be copperhead. And I didn't put him in this presentation, but we have the photos of him at the hospital after that little baby copperhead bit him, and his hand swelled up pretty bad. So this is, again, it's probably wise not to fool with snakes unless you're with someone who really knows quite a bit about them, because apparently this gentleman did not. And last but not least, mark your calendars. I do have one more presentation before I take about a 6-week hiatus. And the reason I'm taking that hiatus, many of you know we have that SWAP program, that Student Wildlands Adventure Program. I've got 24 students from different states coming into New Mexico. And so I'm going to take a break to prepare for that and do that. But I do have one more presentation, and if I'm not mistaken, I scheduled it for next week. And so I'm going to work quickly on that. If you want to sign up for that, fantastic. But there's what I'm going to do with this particular presentation. There's a couple of diseases of late that have really caused quite a stir in the wildlife world. Chronic wasting disease is one because it affects deer, and everyone loves and is very familiar with deer. Another big disease that I'm probably going to talk about, there's actually a few more. There's white nose syndrome, and Logan is my Batman besides my Snake Man. And white nose syndrome affects bat and is tremendously devastating to bat populations. And then there's one that's affecting amphibians called BD, and I forget the genus and species for that, but it's really, really bad. So we're going to talk about some of these diseases that are having major wildlife implications, and so that will actually be next week. I'll do some announcements for that on the Facebook page here shortly, but that'll be the last webinar before we take a break, and then we'll be coming back in August. And so with that, y'all know how to sign up for the classes. Anyone that took this class, this would be a really great one for you to comment on Facebook, because I imagine most of you are snake, I don't want to say snake virgins, but snake novices. And so if you want to provide comment and hopefully let us know how we did on this snake class, since snakes are not your specialty, we would love to get some feedback on our Facebook page.
Yeah, this is one of my first presentations I've done like this in a long time. Definitely my first webinar. So any kind of critiques, comments, please let me know. I do want to add a couple of things just to make sure kind of people have an idea. If you are bitten by a snake, again, seek medical advice just in case, especially if you don't know what type it is. There's a common misconception, though, that people always say that you need to capture the snake that bit you or take a good picture of it. If you're bit by a snake, especially a venomous snake in most of North America, the antivenom that's been made is made for pit vipers, and all but the coral snake are pit vipers. So it doesn't matter necessarily what snake you got bit by. If it was a coral snake, it does help to know that, but as far as if you get bit by a cottonmouth, a copperhead, a rattlesnake, anything like that, you don't need to try to take a picture of the snake. You don't need to try to kill it, because you will increase your chances of being bit again or somebody else being bit. So just get to the hospital, get your medical treatment going. All the antivenom is made to treat pit vipers, and that's more than likely the snake that is going to bite you if you are bitten is a pit viper. So that's a good piece of information to know. And here's another thing that I learned a couple years ago from a rattlesnake researcher, is that alpha-gall, the disease spread by ticks that makes people allergic to a lot of mammalian proteins. I know a lot of people are starting to show signs of that. It's kind of moving across the United States as the Lone Star tick moves across. The antivenom is actually made with mammalian proteins. So if you know of somebody that has alpha-gall, or you yourself have alpha-gall and are bit by a venomous snake, make sure to tell the doctor when you get to the hospital, or have somebody relay that type of information, because you can actually have an allergic reaction to the antivenom as well as the venom that's in you, because you have alpha-gall. So that is something that if you know somebody, or if you are yourself, it's something to let your doctor know, or like I said, let somebody pass on to medical personnel.
Logan, do you know the answer to Susan's questions about the forked tongue being just for venomous? I don't think so. I think non-venomous snakes also will have a forked tongue as well.
Yeah, it's not an indicative thing. All snakes normally have a forked tongue.
Well, we are so glad that you learned quite a bit. I've learned a few things. Like I said, Logan has always been my go-to snake guy, and so he's a resource for this Wildlife for You. Again, any questions that pop up later, or especially any identification questions you may have, by all means, reach out to us. But I want to thank you. We do this for you guys. The fact that you guys keep coming back and wanting to absorb more of this wildlife information, there's no better outlet for me than to be able to teach people about the amazing animals that I work with. And I'm sure Logan feels the same.
Yeah, if anybody, I'll do a shameless plug, but if anybody wants to follow me on either Instagram or Twitter, you can follow me at Barber, Barber, Outdoors. I generally post pictures of things I come across in the field doing the job. A lot of it's bat focused, or probably snake focused, but just kind of general information and cool pictures. And just like I said, I love sharing what I like doing.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of the evening and a wonderful weekend and a fantastic 4th. But sign up if you want to do the wildlife disease.